Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about some table issues, things that kind of go around and around the table that can interrupt the flow of your game. So while there kind of can be a lot of things that can interrupt a session or throw a kink into your game, today we're going to talk about some specific things such as player buy-in issues, players versus storyteller, issues with house rules, like when a rule isn't really working for your game or your table, and also a bit of some what I like to call player versus storyteller or DM versus player. That can be a little tricky, but we're going to address it. So first, I want to talk about player buy-in, right? So what is player buy-in? Player buy-in is when a player of the game is fully engaged in the story that you're telling and is participating around the table. Now, we've all had games where one player or maybe two or three aren't really all there at us when we're playing at the table. Either they're on their phone, toying around with something, or they're just not paying attention or not involved. Those types of things happen. Sometimes it can be understandable. Sometimes a player is either waiting for the storyteller to finish a scene for them so they can come join the rest of the characters, or maybe they just did a run, like say you're playing Shadowrun and they were in the Matrix and doing their hacking bit while the other players went and did other stuff on their own. And there's a bit of that disconnect, so the player really has nothing to do or isn't near the other characters as their character. So in those cases, that can sometimes be understandable. What we're talking about here as a table problem is when a player, his character or her character or their character is at the table and is with the other characters and they just don't stay involved. They're fiddling with other things. That can be disruptive. Now, things happen with players where maybe they had a bad day or there's other things going on, and maybe just that session they're just not feeling it or they're just not all there. And that's fine. People are people. Not every day is a good day for everybody. Sometimes people are more distracted or less distracted at the table. Sometimes things come up. So in those cases, it tends to happen sometimes. But this is more of a situation where it happens repeatedly. Session after session, a player is just not really getting involved. So what can you do when this happens? This is something that I've seen plague both my own table and many of the tables I played around with other storytellers and other game masters. And I've seen a couple interesting ways to address it. Now, not all those solutions are going to work for everybody. There really is no one size fits all solution for this. So there are some ideas though that we can use to somewhat combat this sort of issue. So one of those is if it's a particular player that just keeps on checking out, I guess, mentally during the game and is playing on their phone or checking their iPad or doing other things, maybe before the session or after the session, pull the player aside, ask him, you okay? Is everything going all right? I noticed that you're, are you bored? Is it just not your type of game? What's up? Just have a casual conversation. It doesn't have to be hostile. It doesn't have to be tense. Just, come to them as a person, as a friend. You're playing with them. You're running a story for them. They should hopefully be open to talking to you about something, like if the game's not to their speed or, maybe it's just not their style of play, or maybe they're just having trouble grasping the system. That can happen. Sometimes, I've definitely been in situations where I'm playing a new game system and I just don't get it. And so I'm kind of slow on the draw when it comes to interacting with other players. So I want to make sure that I understand everything before I really get involved. And that can be the case. And hopefully, if that is the case with a player, they have no problem telling you, oh, well, I'm just not getting the setting. Can you explain some things to me? And if that's the case, it is one of the easiest things to resolve. You sit down, talk with the player, help resolve some of the issues, maybe explain the things about the setting, or give them a little bit of confidence that, they feel more, effective or more comfortable with the setting so they can start participating more. And that's a really awesome way to do it. However, there are some cases where it can be not really on the player or not really on, how the setting is portrayed or, their lack of understanding the material. Sometimes it just can be that they're just bored, I know I've had that as a player, playing a game and it just not really my speed. It doesn't really hit on the things that I enjoy playing, or You know, it's just not a setting or a story that I'm finding enjoyable. You know, that could be a big thing. Like for me, I hate puzzle games. I hate puzzles. I love playing character types that actually have to probably be the biggest puzzle solvers, so like wizards and things like that. But I don't like puzzles themselves. They just annoy me. It's not because I don't think they can be fun. It's just I don't like doing them in tabletop. You know, and that's just my little quirk. I like mystery. I like connecting the dots. I just don't like actual puzzles. Like, here's a jar with this particular crest of type of magic, and you have to match it to these things in specific orders of phases of the moon by the date of the time back in the history of the world where this person was. No, thank you. You know, I mean, not really my bag. I'd rather keep things going a little more, or have it to where we can start, you know, feeling like we've accomplished something as opposed to banging our head against the wall on a puzzle. That's just one of my quirks. And I know some players out there may feel the same way about mystery games, you know, so sometimes a player is bored. But sometimes it's not the setting and sometimes it's not the story. Sometimes they just don't feel like they're having an effect, right? And that can be a big thing that we as storytellers can resolve. And one way I like to do that, if a player on the table doesn't feel like they're having an impact, or they feel useless, or they feel like, oh, another character has my specialty and therefore I don't have a time to shine, is trying to find a way each game session to make everyone's character have a moment in the spotlight. So that can be as simple as giving them a task that their character can resolve, or making it specially tailored. Say, for example, there's two wizards, but the one who's quieter or not as involved, met a person a while back, or maybe somebody they went to school with when they were learning how to cast magic, is in town and is a vital connection, and that brings that player as a vital part of the story to help further it into the game. And you know, that progression of the storyline depends on them actually being there. It may or may not, but you make it feel that way. You make them feel vital. You know, give them a chance to say, I contribute to this story. And I think that by doing that, by giving everybody a time to shine, it really starts to like reduce the amount of time players spend doing something else other than being involved in the game. It doesn't work for everybody, and it can be a little challenging sometimes. I mean, really, you have to kind of know the characters. You have to know their backstories. You know, you have to figure out some of their motivations, you know, or some of the things they like doing. That type of thing can take some time and can be a little intensive. But I think that once you start putting those mini spotlights for characters a session, it really helps break down that idea or that feeling of like, I'm not contributing to the game. I'm not contributing to the story. You can really start drawing them in. Now, that tends to make people feel more involved and get more interested. And I've seen it work to great success. But there are other things you can do as well to start tying in more story-related things. You know, not just on a session basis, but overall throughout the course of the story you're trying to tell. So, for example, maybe add details to your story that involve character background. Not just one, not just two, but start pulling in as many as you can. That makes sense, obviously, to the story you're trying to tell. So, for example, maybe a major NPC they run into is a former lover of a character, or maybe a sibling, or a mentor. You know, you start bringing these things in from their histories, and it feels like, and I mentioned this in the first video, it feels like a lived-in world, right? They feel they're part of this world by bringing in these things from their past, by bringing in things that they've done, and it kind of creates more of an impetus for being involved in the story because it feels personal, right? And when you make a story feel personal to characters, it tends to make the players more interested. It tends to reduce some of that downtime, you know, in between dice rolls or in between scenes. And, you know, sometimes it can really build up, you know, some anticipation for the next game. Like, hey, I can't wait to play the next game. You know, we met so-and-so and I remember we ran into him before and he helped us out, or they're chasing after the villain that has eluded them for so long. That was originally a minor character that they ran into like once upon a time, you know, months ago in game, but now he's a big bad guy and now they have a reason to kind of seek out, you know, justice from this person. And that can keep people more involved. It can keep people coming to the table with excitement and, you know, less malaise, essentially. You know, you actually make it more of a, I'm involved in the story, things I've done have mattered, and all of my friends and I that are playing are just having a blast. You can really start to get that level of participation that can really drive a game from being good to being really good, or just, in the eyes of your players, great. And that can be a lot of fun, and it's very satisfying, I think, as a storyteller. So a big part of that, like I said, is keeping those things personal, which you start to get this idea of like player versus story. You kind of take what a player has created in their character, the backstory they've made with you. And then some games, making that backstory is part of the character creation process. Like Legend of the Five Rings, 5th edition, 20 questions as part of character creation. You actually make decisions about your character's past while you're making your character. So that lets you come out of the gate with a character that has, a history, some semblance of what they were doing, what their goals are. And that can be a lot easier to, as a storyteller, take ammunition, I suppose would be the word I would use, to help, fuel your storytelling. This is a bad analogy. It gives you great, fuel to create stories with by knowing something of the character's backstory, right? Which is why prologues and 20 questions that are usually in role-playing games, I think they're phenomenal. Like, they're a great idea to actually go through with your players. Not everybody wants to do them. They'd rather go to the mechanical crunch of making a character, or adding up all their dots, or spending their points, or buying their feats. And that's understandable. Some people just like that aspect of the game more. But if you can sit down with the player and learn about their character, you can make this really awesome interwoven fabric of what the player wants, what they made their character for, and how the story is written, right? You can really start to get this idea of how this character fits into the story I am telling. When you get that, you get this idea of it's not just the characters that the players made, the player gets involved. So the player is now part of the story too, because their creation is now front and center. And that can be really fun, and you can get some really good results off of it. When I first started running games, I neglected a lot of this. I didn't think it was necessary. I thought that by running through the 20 questions about characters, running through prologues, I thought was kind of a thing that, we could do it if we're bored, but really let's just make characters and hit the ground running and just make a game and just run and roll some dice. And it was fine. It was fine at that time for the groups I was running with. It was, it was expected to more get a character done as opposed to fleshed out. And there's nothing wrong with that. If your crew is playing more modules that player's story doesn't really back into too much, it can be fine. If you're playing an Adventure League, for example, story for your character is mostly about stuff to talk around the campfire between monster hunts, right? If you're playing a Gen Con game, you probably won't even make your character. You'll have a pre-made character you're going to come in and play. So you have your story that's already made. So a lot of times I just felt it was a waste of time. However, as I started getting more into storytelling and started to enjoy my part of writing the story more, I wanted to get more feedback from my players. I wanted to know what their characters were so I can write interesting things. So, for example, betrayal for me is a fun storyline or plot point to run. A character that the players thought was an ally to their characters suddenly shows their true colors and is betraying them. Unless they have history with that character, unless that they've had interactions, or maybe it was written into their backstories as like a mentor figure. Sometimes that impact on a role-play basis doesn't mean much of anything. If you tie it in, though, it can mean a lot. It can really kind of spur players forward with their characters to get to the bottom of the plot line, and that can be a lot of fun. So yeah, when I first started, I thought that if I just told a good enough story, it wouldn't matter if it was interconnected with players. And sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it wasn't. But when I started really kind of delving into this idea, I started having a lot better feedback from my players. They enjoyed things. They felt that their characters were actually part of something, as opposed to just being some person they made up, in 20 minutes. They feel that there's some sort of history they could explore, and if you have groups that are really into role-playing, that can really help, especially since they don't feel like, all our role-play really is with each other and maybe the town merchant when we go and buy stuff or sell stuff, not really, anybody else aside from getting a quest. Mostly just hack and slash. And, that's a valid way to play a game, doing dungeon crawls. That's totally fine. But if you have players that like doing a lot of role-play and it helps really get them involved, try it, sit down with a character that a player turns into you, look it over and see like, okay, hey, So who taught you this skill? Where did you learn this? How do you feel about, this type of, creature, or how do you feel about this type of adventure? What kind of things make your character excited? What are they afraid of? Those types of things, when a player tells them to you, can actually help you build stories for them later on, and can be very useful in setting up like future encounters that really kind of drive at what a particular character was made to do, or what a particular character has as a fear, or has as a hope, or has as a dream. You can really start to make those part of your stories, and that really gets players more involved, usually with their character and the story you're trying to tell, and that can lead to a really rewarding experience for everybody. So thinking about that, how do we do stuff like that, right? What does it really matter if we make something personal? So I'm gonna give a quick example, and let's take my shirt, right? So I've got a shirt right now where you can see Spider-Man and Iron Man on it. This is a shirt for pro registration for Marvel Comics. For those of you who know Civil War, hats off to you. This is one of the shirts that came out to kind of play off of that theme back in the comics, way before Captain America: Civil War, the movie. I digress. Anyways, so if I was running a comic book game and we had somebody playing Spider-Man, and it was during the registration movement, and let's say Iron Man's an NPC, how can we make a simple encounter mean more to both the character Spider-Man and Spider-Man's player, right? So let's put together a scenario here. Let's say that Spider-Man is pro registration, like he was in the comic books for quite some time originally, and he is out patrolling, let's say, New York, per usual, right? And Aunt May's out, and she gets attacked or gets caught in the crossfire in a supervillain fight, right? But the hero in the fight is anti-registration. He's dodging the shield. He's dodging the other heroes who are trying to get in the register or throw them at the raft. He's basically a bad guy according to other heroes. He's breaking the law. Spider-Man sees this, swings in, but as he's doing so, something happens where collateral damage. Aunt May is threatened, but the hero, the anti-registration hero, saves Aunt May or Mary Jane or whoever else you want to be as important as Spider-Man, saves them and gets hurt in the process. Bad guy may get away, he may not, who knows, up to you, but saves basically the person that the hero cares about. So now the hero has a conflict of loyalties. This person, let's say the hero saw Spider-Man coming, knows Spider-Man is there to take out both him and the bad guy and arrest them both, basically take him into custody. But now he has a hero that helped one of his loved ones. What does he do? You've made it from a black and white situation to a gray area. Does Spider-Man take the hero in anyways? Maybe give him a thanks, and maybe it kind of builds up cred from the anti-registration heroes in Spider-Man's eyes that they're still out there doing their job and saving people and protecting people regardless of whether or not they're breaking the law? Or does Spider-Man let the guy go? Give him a one-up. You get this one, you saved someone I care about, I appreciate that, you did the right thing, get out of here before other people show up. Or does it make him flip sides? These are the types of things that turn a black and white story into something more complex and more layered, right? We can be as mustache twirling and evil as we want with NPCs, but when you start making the actions of some of the other NPCs relatable, that creates complexities for the players that actually hit on points in their characters' beliefs, you really start making a more complex weave that can really aid in how they view their character stories and how they play them going forward. It creates a really awesome dynamic. So you solve this problem of people not paying attention around the table to really being an environment where they're in character, they're really thinking about their characters, and they're moving forward with those and having fun with it. But that can lead to a pitfall. If you are too on, right? You're too focused on everything players do and throw stuff at them in opposition, you run a danger of falling into a trap that even the most experienced storytellers run into. I know I've done it a lot. And that's creating an environment of the storyteller versus the storyteller versus player is one of those situations where a person running a game makes the game about being better or beating the players. And it sounds very, cut and dry, like when you're doing it, but it's easy to get to that point without even realizing it. For example, let's say you're running a game and your players have beat the bad guy much faster than you thought possible. They just walked in, the dice were on their side, and just boom, destroyed the bad guy. And you're like, wow, that was supposed to be a really challenging fight. I think I'll make the next one harder. And then they win again. And you're like, you know what? Let's keep upping this. Let's keep on making the scales and the stakes bigger. And you go further and further and further. And eventually you find yourself to the point where a town guard arrests a character if they're jaywalking. You know, you get to this point where every potential conversation with NPC is a life or death situation. You know, if the PCs look at this guy funny, then he's going to do this bad thing to them. And that's fine every once in a while, because some NPCs, that's just their temperament. But if that's how every NPC acts, and if every NPC has the means at their disposal to ruin the lives of the player characters, that's not fun. You've now made an environment where you're being the stereotypical oppositional storyteller. You're being the bad guy, the players. And yeah, you play the bad guys, you run the bad guys, but you're not supposed to be the bad guy. You know, you're creating a shared story between you and your players. And if you step out of that for too long and start making it adversarial, nobody has fun. It gets really rough. I've seen players be completely ruined for entire settings, their entire game systems, because they had one horrific experience after another with storytellers were just so adversarial that every time they stepped outside their house, every decision was a life or death one. You know, they're making up characters every other week because they looked at somebody funny or said the wrong thing to a character that got them killed by an NPC. So you gotta watch that. Take a step back, get some perspective. You know, really, if you start seeing players get a little uncomfortable on the table after every time they get something bad happen to them from an NPC, take a step back, take a breather, get some perspective, and ask yourself, is it because this is just an uncomfortable situation, it's tense because of the story? Or is it tense and uncomfortable because I've punished them for the last 5 NPC interactions they've had because they've either flubbed an etiquette roll or because they misspoke a word or didn't call something the proper title? That gets burned. And yeah, in some cases, storytellers will think that, oh, I'm being honorable to the setting because you can't just walk into a prince's court and not do this thing, or you can't just do this one thing. That's fine. You know, there's ways to teach players that that's not acceptable. And yeah, one of them is establishing consequences. But if you have to keep on beating your players over the head with consequences, one of two things is wrong. One, the players are having trouble grasping the minutiae of the setting, which is fine, you know, and that's where you step in your role as an educator and try to explain it to them and walk them through it. Give them learning, give them lessons, and don't just punish them without telling them why. You know, show them here's how you can do this next time, or give them a pass, or my favorite, ask them, are you sure you want to do that? And just give it a pause. They'll make them reconsider what they're doing. And if they say, well, yeah, why? Then you can explain, well, here's how that can be taken. You know, use what's on their sheet. Just because a player doesn't have the skill level that his character doesn't mean that they should be punished for not understanding that. If they have the stat, let them know. Give them a hand up. You don't have to do it all the time, but if they still don't get it, then there's something that maybe you guys should talk about setting. But you can use it as a teaching opportunity instead of, you know, just being an adversary. Or the second thing is, not that the players just don't understand, maybe you're taking it a little too far. And that's a hard thing to admit. I've had to do it. It's difficult. You know, I've realized I'm punishing players too much. I need to take a step back. Let them have fun a little more at the expense of, you know, maybe like a little small setting detail. That's fine. You know, if you change something around your game, nobody's gonna come break down your door, you know? Speaking of which, changing things about house rules. When to know when a rule's not working. How do you figure it out? In my games, it's usually over time. Sometimes you'll know right off the bat. So, for example, I'm running L5R, 5th edition, the Topaz Championship. Maybe you've seen 1 or 2 of our videos on it, our test runs, right? In that game, they don't have a movement attribute, and there's no set movement. Like, for example, in D&D, it's a set movement. Medium-sized creatures move a base of 30 feet, you know, every turn, which can be modified, etc., etc. In other games, they'll just say similar things. You know, for every point in this attribute, you move X amount of squares or X amount of feet, whatever. L5R 5th edition has bands, and it's very vague of how far a band is. It's very playable. Alien Great game, love the setting, love the system, has even more vague rules on movement. It's not even down to feet, it's not even down to a general area, it's large swaths you can move, and then it's just encounter range, which is simple, and it works well if you're doing just theater of the mind and you're not having maps or anything like that, or maybe a map is just for reference and not actually to scale. Those movement systems work great for that. But for my games, since COVID hit, we've been playing on Roll20, and with Roll20 we use the grid, and it just makes things easier for us. So we like using the grid, but grid-based movement doesn't really work when there's no defined distance that you can move. It becomes very like, we don't know, roughly this way, roughly this far is how far you move. So what we did was we made a house rule for our L5R game. We're like, you know what? Why don't you get to move, let's say 2 times your water rate? Roughly in line with movement for 4th edition, which we played a lot of. So for us, it was an easy transition. It was a house rule we made up on the spot because it just seemed it was going to be easier for us to do combat and movement on a grid, in the future as a game. And it's worked out fine so far. Some house rules don't work out so well. Some you may not discover until far later into the gameplay. When somebody picks up either a talent or a feat or a skill or a discipline or a power, what have you, that just seems super unbalancing, and you're watching it win every encounter. And that's when you get to do one of the things that is hard to do, especially since a character uses a skill or whatever it is so often. The player loves it because it's a win button. You have to nerf something. And it's hard to do. Some players really, really object to it, like really, really object to it, and will argue with you. But I found if you usually come to a character or a character's player and say, hey, listen, this is just for overall balance, like for fun. NPCs are going to have the same ruling you have. It's going to reduce the power of this thing altogether because it's really kind of unbalancing. Most time, in my experience, when we've had that discussion with a player, they kind of get it and just chill. Sometimes they don't. And that's something that can be unfortunate because a player at that point, it feels is more interested in winning than having fun with everybody else, So that can be a little bit of a touch and go situation. House rules are often a necessary part of life when you run games for extended periods of time. Anybody here who's watching who has played in a, say, live action organization for role playing, you'll notice games have a ton of house rules because the staff has decided that these rules make the game run smoother for our players, and here's how we want to have these rules interpreted in our game. That can be difficult when you're trying to run a game for the first time and you're just getting used to the rules and the rules don't all make sense to you. It can take a couple read-throughs before you start getting comfortable. But the tricky thing about making house rules is be careful, because you don't want to make something that mechanically changes the game so much that it alters the way the game's played, right? If you have to make so many house rules that you no longer are playing what resembles the game you started out with, maybe the system's just not right for you. Maybe find another system that works better, or maybe homebrew something yourself. It's a challenge, but it can be worth it. To be honest, I try to do as few house rules for the games I run as possible, because I don't want to have to make a situation where players are reading more of my added rules than they are the real rules, because that just gets tedious for everybody involved. So I'll say, for example, here's a common one. D&D game, do you use encumbrance? I don't. We just use common sense. Sure, there are weight limits and it's easy to follow, but for us, it's like my players don't really like tracking every ounce of gear that they're carrying, and not a lot of games have an encumbrance system. It's usually just based off common sense. So, for example, Vampire, I don't think really has an encumbrance system that I've seen. Yeah, you can lift X amount more pounds or whatever with potence or supernatural strength, but for normal everyday carrying stuff, it's not really a thing that comes into play. You don't really think about it. You don't really get involved with it. Other game systems really harp more on encumbrance than others. We don't use them. That's a house rule. We're not using this rule. Magic's one thing is not always. Magic's one thing that's often house ruled in games. How common are magical items? How common are these things? So house rules can be pretty casual. Some can be more setting based. Some can be more based off mechanic balance. But don't feel that you have to have them, and don't feel that you shouldn't have them. Whatever works for your table is really what you should be doing. So yeah, bottom line, if a rule is not working for your game or for your table, or you feel that you could just tweak it a little bit and make it more balanced or better for your game, go ahead and do it. You know, there's nothing that says that if you make a mistake by doing so, you can't change it back. You know, or when you make a house rule, run it for a couple sessions and ask your players, like, how do you guys feel about how this rule is changed? Is it cool? Like, is that fair? Like, what do you guys think? Getting feedback is always an awesome part of running a game, because that can help you hone the game for that group and can help you become a better overall storyteller, because you learn lessons about how players take your change. You learn lessons about how they respond to you when you start making sweeping house rules, or hopefully you don't, but if you do make sweeping house rules, or if you make more streamlined charts for damage or things like that. So getting feedback is an important part of that. But nobody's going to come to your house, break down your door, flip your table, and say you can't run a rule that way, because that's not how the book wrote it. Do what you want if it works for your table. If your players think it's cool, keep with it, man. Enjoy it. Just do what's best for you and your table. That's really the best thing that I could say about house rules. Be careful. Don't go overboard with them, and you should be good. But in closing, a lot of these things that we've talked about, table problems, may seem insurmountable at first. This rule doesn't work. I don't know how to change it. Or, this player's not paying attention to the game. They're more intent on their phone than they are about the story. Why are my players kind of bowing out or getting tense around the table? These things that you see as a storyteller, you can adjust, you can fix them, you can address them. It takes patience and being willing to listen to your players when they give you feedback. Don't take it personally, especially if you're new to storytelling. Don't take it personally at all. This is part of learning, the game. Is part of learning how to run stuff, learning how to change things. Nobody should expect you out of the box to be this awesome grandmaster storyteller who changes rules and writes mechanics professionally, every day. Be more realistic with yourself. You're going to make mistakes. I know I've made a ton of them, but I've learned from them all. And it's just that process of getting feedback from your players and having an open mind and listening to them. It'll help you be a better storyteller. It'll really help streamline your games and make the table more enjoyable. And remember, the biggest bit of advice anybody can ever give you is to just always keep in your head that running the game should be fun for you, just like it should be fun for your players that play the game. This is for everybody. There shouldn't be an onus on one side or the other to not have fun so that others may have fun. If you're not having fun, you're not feeling it, maybe switch gears. Talk to the players like, hey, how you guys feeling about the game? You may, surprisingly or not, hear similar things back from them. We're not really feeling it. And if that's the case, then maybe you guys can find something to switch up the game, or maybe find a way to make it better. But, you're supposed to have fun too. Well, that's it for this episode. Next week, we're going to talk about running modules and doing homebrew settings and homebrew stories. I know I'm not a really big fan of modules. I've run some. I've run D&D modules. I've run Legend of the Five Rings modules. I've run some stuff for like superhero games out of modules, but I'm not really a big fan. And when I do run modules, I heavily modify them. Anyways, if you liked today's video and what we talked about, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe if you want alerts for when the new videos come out. We're going to try to do these a lot more often, at least every week for this particular type of thing. We've got some more stuff in the works involving interviewing storytellers and doing some like storyteller challenges, which I think are kind of fun. So we'll see where we go from there, but we'd love to see you back. And don't forget, have fun out there when you're running your game. That's the point of this whole thing, right? See you guys later.